The biggest secrets of the X-Men explained. Fan Project Disclaimer. This video is an unofficial, fan-made documentary created for entertainment and educational purposes. It is not affiliated with, endorsed by, or sponsored by Marvel Comics, Marvel Entertainment, or the Walt Disney Company. All characters, stories, and events discussed belong to their respective copyright holders. This is a work of commentary and analysis. Introduction. For most of their history, the X-Men have been defined by the things everyone can see. The costumes, the battles, the headlines about a school for gifted children that always seem to be under siege from one threat or another. To the public inside the Marvel Universe, and often to readers as well, the X-Men have looked like a fairly straightforward kind of superhero team. A group of mutants, led by a man in a wheelchair, trying to protect a world that mostly feared and hated them. But underneath that public story, there has always been another one. It is a story made of things that were hidden, decisions made in private by people who believed they had good reasons for the silence, memories that were altered, buried, or simply taken away, relationships built on withheld truths, entire chapters of mutant history that existed for years, sometimes for decades, before anyone realized they had ever happened at all. Professor Charles Xavier, the man the world came to know as a symbol of hope and peaceful coexistence, kept secrets from the very students he claimed to trust completely. Some of those secrets involved memories he altered inside their minds without asking permission. Some involved decisions about the future of mutant kind that he made alone, believing it was safer that way. Magneto, his oldest friend and his most consistent adversary, carried a history that took years to fully surface. A childhood shaped by unimaginable horror, an early friendship with Xavier built on a shared dream that would eventually split them apart. A private war fought as much with his own conscience as with the world around him. Wolverine spent decades not knowing who he actually was. His mind had been altered so many times, by so many different people and organizations, that even he could not always tell which of his own memories were real. When the truth about his past finally began to surface, it reshaped one of the longest-running mysteries in the history of the medium. Jean Grey's story became something far stranger than anyone expected when she first joined the original team of X-Men. What began as a story about a young telepath and telekinetic gradually became one of the most complicated pieces of cosmic mythology in all of Marvel Comics, tangled up with a living embodiment of destruction and rebirth that did not behave the way anyone assumed it would. Mystique and Destiny, two of the most quietly influential mutants in the history of the X-Men, spent years shaping events from just outside the spotlight. Their relationship, their choices, and their connection to Rogue would not be fully understood until long after readers first encountered them. Mr. Sinister spent more than a century manipulating bloodlines, orchestrating events, and waiting patiently for genetic outcomes that would not fully make sense until generations of X-Men had lived and died. Few villains in comic book history have played a longer game. And then there is Moira MacTaggert. For years, she was simply Xavier's close friend and a brilliant geneticist who dedicated her life to studying mutation. Then a single revelation completely rewrote everything readers thought they understood about her, about Xavier, and about the deep, secret history of mutant kind itself. This documentary exists to walk through those secrets, not as a list of trivia, and not as a collection of surprising facts recited one after another, but as a series of interconnected stories about what was hidden, why it was hidden, and what changed once the truth came out. Some of these secrets were hidden from the characters themselves. Others were hidden from the readers, tucked away in continuity until a writer years later decided to pull the thread. Some were the result of careful, deliberate planning by characters within the story. Others emerged more gradually, the way certain truths in long-running fiction tend to accumulate weight over time, becoming more significant the longer they stay buried. We will move roughly in order, beginning with secrets that are personal and relatively contained, then widening outward into family history, then into the long conspiracies of characters like Mr. Sinister, and finally into revelations that reshape the fundamental understanding of what it means to be a mutant. By the end, we will arrive at the modern era of Krakoa, resurrection, and the war against Orchis, where many of the oldest secrets in X-Men history finally collided with the present. Where continuity is complicated, and X-Men continuity is almost always complicated, we will take the time to explain it properly. Where later stories retconned or reinterpreted earlier ones, we will walk through both versions so the shift makes sense. And where the exact details of a comic are uncertain, we will say so rather than inventing something that sounds convincing but is not accurate. This is a story about the X-Men, but it is really a story about the difference between what people believe about their own history and what turns out to be true. It is fitting, in a way, that a team built around the idea of hidden potential, mutants whose true nature has to be discovered rather than simply seen, would have a history built the same way. So settle in, let the world outside grow quiet, and let's begin uncovering the truths that the X-Men themselves took years, in some cases decades, to fully understand. Chapter 1. The secret Xavier never told his students. Charles Xavier built his entire life around a single idea, that humans and mutants could coexist peacefully, if only mutants could be taught to control their gifts and humans could be shown that mutants were not something to fear. It was a beautiful idea, and Xavier believed in it with total sincerity. But the way he pursued that idea often involved secrecy, manipulation, and decisions he made for other people without asking them first. From the earliest days of the X-Men, Xavier was already keeping things from his students. He shaped their training, their missions, and in some cases their very memories, according to what he believed was necessary for the greater good. He rarely explained his full reasoning, and he almost never gave his students the option to disagree with decisions that affected their own lives. One of the clearest examples of this pattern involved his use of telepathy on the people closest to him. Xavier possessed one of the most powerful minds on the planet, capable of reading thoughts, planting suggestions, and erasing memories with barely any effort. He treated this ability as a tool to be used whenever he judged it necessary, and over the years he used it on his own students more than once. There were moments when Xavier suppressed a student's memories of a traumatic event, believing it would protect them from psychological damage. There were moments when he altered what someone remembered about a mission gone wrong, worried that the full truth might fracture the team. In some cases, he made these decisions in the heat of a crisis, with no time to consult anyone. In other cases, he made them quietly over time, without any of his students ever suspecting that their own minds had been touched. For a long time, none of this was framed as villainy. Xavier was consistently written as a good man doing what he believed was right, often at great personal cost. But the pattern was there from very early on, and later writers would return to it again and again, using it to complicate the image of Xavier as a simple, benevolent mentor. Part of what made this complicated was the sheer scale of Xavier's power. Most people, even those closest to him, understood only a fraction of what he was capable of. Cerebro, the machine he built to locate mutants anywhere on Earth, amplified his telepathy to a degree that few characters in the Marvel Universe could rival. In theory, Xavier could have used that power to reshape the minds of every mutant, and eventually every human being on the planet. In practice, he restrained himself, but the fact that the option existed at all created a persistent tension in his relationships with the people who trusted him most. His students eventually began to notice the pattern. Longtime X-Men like Cyclops, Jean Grey, and later Wolverine each had moments where they discovered that Xavier had shaped their understanding of events without telling them. Sometimes these discoveries came during a crisis, when a psychic attack from an enemy unearthed a memory Xavier had buried. Sometimes they came through quieter means, an offhand comment, an old file, a conversation with someone who had not been affected by Xavier's editing. Each time this happened, it damaged trust in a way that never fully healed. Xavier would apologize or attempt to explain his reasoning, and in most cases his students would eventually forgive him, at least outwardly. But the underlying question never went away. If the most powerful telepath most of them had ever known was willing to alter their memories when he believed it was necessary, how could they ever be completely certain of their own recollections? This tension became especially important in Wolverine's story, since so much of his history involved memory loss and manipulation by outside forces. When it eventually became clear that Xavier himself had, at different points, made choices about what Wolverine should and should not remember, it added Xavier to a long list of people who had treated Logan's mind as something to be managed rather than respected. The deeper question underneath all of this was about consent. Xavier genuinely believed that some truths were too dangerous, too painful, or too destabilizing to be handed to people without careful management. He saw himself as a caretaker of fragile minds in a violent world, and in many cases his intentions were not cruel. But intention and impact are not the same thing, and the repeated pattern of Xavier making unilateral decisions about other people's inner lives left a lasting mark on how both his students and readers understood him. By the time later eras of X-Men storytelling arrived, particularly the era surrounding the founding of Krakoa, this pattern had become one of the defining features of Xavier's character. He was no longer read simply as a wise old mentor. He had become a far more complicated figure, capable of profound compassion and profound overreach in the very same breath. Understanding that complexity is essential to understanding almost every other secret in this documentary, because so many of them trace back, in one way or another, to decisions Xavier made and chose not to explain. It is worth pausing here to consider why Xavier so rarely faced lasting consequences for this pattern within the story itself. Part of the answer lies in how thoroughly his students depended on him, not just for training, but for a sense of belonging in a world that had often rejected them before they ever arrived at his school. Many of his earliest students were teenagers who had nowhere else to go, and Xavier represented for them the first adult who had ever offered acceptance rather than fear. That dependency made it difficult for them to fully confront him, even when they suspected, or later confirmed, that he had altered their minds without permission. There is also the matter of scale. A single act of memory suppression, viewed in isolation, could be explained away as an emergency measure taken under extraordinary pressure. It was only when readers, and eventually the characters themselves, began adding up the pattern across years of stories that the full picture became uncomfortable. Xavier was not making one difficult choice under duress. He was making the same kind of choice, again and again, whenever he judged that the truth was too dangerous for the people closest to him to handle on their own terms. This raises a question that the comics have returned to many times without ever fully settling. Was Xavier's caution justified by the genuine dangers his students faced, or did it reflect something closer to a controlling instinct dressed up as protection? Different writers, across different decades, have leaned toward different answers, which is part of why Xavier's legacy remains so contested among longtime readers even now. He is remembered as a hero. He is also remembered as a man who, time and again, decided he knew better than the people who trusted him most. Chapter 2: The Man Who Wanted to Build a Perfect World. To understand why Xavier behaved the way he did, it helps to look at the broader vision he was working toward. Xavier did not simply want mutants to be tolerated. He wanted a future in which mutants and humans lived together as equals, in a world that had moved past its fear of what mutation represented. That vision required an enormous amount of behind-the-scenes work, much of which never appeared in the flashy battles that defined most X-Men comics. Xavier spent years quietly building infrastructure for that future. He funded the X-Men through his own considerable wealth. He built Cerebro not only to locate mutants in danger, but to gather a kind of hidden census of mutant kind across the planet, tracking who was out there long before those individuals ever appeared in a story. He maintained contact with government officials, scientists, and other influential figures, often working to steer policy in directions that would be safer for mutants, all without most of his students knowing the details. This behind-the-scenes maneuvering placed Xavier in an unusual position. He was, in many ways, a political operator disguised as a schoolteacher. His students saw him mentoring young mutants and leading missions. Few of them saw the extent to which he was also negotiating, planning, and positioning pieces on a much larger board. Some of Xavier's most morally complicated decisions came from this same instinct toward long-term planning. There were points in his history where he chose to work with organizations or individuals that his students would have objected to, believing that short-term compromises were necessary to protect a longer-term goal. There were points where he withheld information about threats to mutant kind, because he judged that panic would do more damage than the threat itself. The danger inherent in Cerebro made this pattern even more significant. A machine capable of locating, and in the wrong hands, controlling every mutant mind on the planet was an extraordinary risk, even when it was used by someone with good intentions. Xavier understood this risk better than anyone, which is part of why he worked so hard to keep certain aspects of Cerebro's true potential quiet, even from his own students. It would be a mistake to read Xavier as simply hypocritical or self-serving. He was, by most measures, one of the most committed idealists in the entire Marvel Universe, willing to sacrifice his own comfort, his relationships, and at times his own body for the dream of coexistence. But that same idealism often blinded him to the cost of his methods. He treated secrecy as a tool of protection rather than a form of control, and it took him a very long time, sometimes an entire lifetime, to fully reckon with the difference. This is part of why later stories, especially those set during the founding of Krakoa, revisited Xavier's history with such a critical eye. The mutant nation he helped build was, in many ways, the largest and most ambitious expression of his lifelong instinct to plan quietly and reveal selectively. Understanding that instinct as it first appeared, decades earlier, in small decisions about what to tell his students, makes it much easier to understand why Krakoa's own secrets, which we will discuss later in this documentary, took the shape that they did. There is a particular irony in the fact that a man so devoted to the idea of mutant acceptance spent so much of his life operating in secret. Xavier's public persona, the wheelchair-bound educator running a school for gifted youngsters, was itself a kind of cover story, one that allowed him to conduct far more consequential work without drawing the kind of scrutiny that a more openly political mutant leader might have attracted. This dual existence, public educator and private strategist, meant that even people who spent years around Xavier often had only a partial understanding of what he was actually working toward at any given moment. Some of his closest allies eventually grew frustrated with this arrangement, feeling that they were being treated as pieces in a larger plan rather than as full partners in it. Others accepted the arrangement, trusting that Xavier's judgment, even when unexplained, was generally sound. This division within his own inner circle reflected the same tension that ran through nearly every relationship Xavier maintained across his life. Genuine affection and respect, complicated by an ongoing imbalance of information that he rarely worked to correct until circumstances forced his hand. Chapter 3: The Boy Who Became Magneto. For a long time, Magneto existed in X-Men comics primarily as a villain, a powerful mutant terrorist who believed that mutants were destined to replace humanity, and who was willing to use violence to make that future arrive sooner. It took years for writers to reveal the history that explained how a man capable of such idealism about mutant potential had also become capable of such ruthlessness in pursuit of it. Magneto's early life was shaped by the Holocaust. As a young Jewish boy in Europe during the rise of the Nazi regime, he experienced persecution, loss, and violence on a scale that would define the rest of his life. He survived internment in a concentration camp, an experience that cost him his family and left him with a permanent understanding of what happens when a society decides that an entire group of people does not deserve to exist. This backstory did not appear all at once. Early X-Men comics gave only glimpses of Magneto's past, treating him mostly as an antagonist without much interior life. Over time, particularly from the 1980s onward, writers filled in the details of his childhood, giving readers a much fuller picture of the trauma that shaped his worldview. This shift transformed Magneto from a stock supervillain into one of the most sympathetic antagonists in all of superhero fiction. Understanding this history changes the meaning of everything Magneto does afterward. His belief that mutants must be prepared to defend themselves by any means necessary was not an abstract political position. It came from direct, lived experience with what happens when a persecuted minority trusts too much in the goodwill of the majority. When Magneto looked at humanity's fear of mutants, he did not see an overreaction that would fade with education and patience. He saw the early stages of something he had already lived through once. This is part of why Magneto's philosophy, even when it led him to terrible actions, always retained a core of moral seriousness that many other villains lacked. He was not motivated by greed or by a simple desire for power. He was motivated by a conviction that his people needed to survive, and that survival sometimes required force. The tragedy of his character is that this same conviction, born from surviving genocide, eventually pushed him toward tactics that echoed the very violence he had suffered. Magneto's hidden history also included a family life that existed largely outside the main X-Men storylines for years. He had children whose full significance would not be understood by readers or by the characters themselves for a long time. His relationships with them, complicated by his choices as a mutant supremacist and by long periods of absence or secrecy, added another layer to his personal history that unfolded gradually across decades of storytelling. By the time Magneto's backstory was fully established, he had become one of the most three-dimensional characters in Marvel Comics. He was neither purely villain nor purely victim, but something more complicated, a man whose worst qualities and his best ones came from the exact same source. It is worth noting how often the story returned to specific, quiet moments between Xavier and Magneto as a way of reminding readers that their conflict was never purely ideological. Chess became a recurring motif across decades of stories, the two men sitting across from each other in relatively calm, private settings, working through the same argument they had been having since they were young men, this time using a board game as a substitute for the battlefield. These scenes mattered because they showed something the larger, more explosive conflicts between the X-Men and the Brotherhood could not. Two people who genuinely respected each other's minds, even when they could not agree on how the future should be built. Chapter 4: Two Old Friends, Two Broken Ideals. One of the deepest hidden histories in X-Men lore is the early relationship between Charles Xavier and Eric Laneshare, the man who would become Magneto. For years, readers understood the two men primarily as opposing forces, Xavier representing peaceful coexistence and Magneto representing militant separatism. It eventually became clear that their relationship had once been something much closer to friendship, even brotherhood, before ideology pulled them apart. Xavier and Magneto met as young men and quickly recognized each other as kindred spirits, two of the most powerful mutants either of them had ever encountered. They spent time together discussing the future of mutant kind, testing each other's abilities, and forming a bond built on mutual respect. Their disagreement was never about whether mutants deserved a future. It was about how that future should be secured. Xavier believed that patience, education, and demonstrated goodwill would eventually convince humanity that mutants were not a threat. Magneto, shaped by his own history, believed this was naive, and that mutants needed to be ready to defend themselves with force if necessary. Both positions came from genuine care about mutant kind's survival. The tragedy was that their disagreement over method eventually hardened into open conflict. This friendship-turned-rivalry gave the entire X-Men mythology one of its most enduring emotional cores. Every battle between the X-Men and the Brotherhood of Mutants carried an extra weight once readers understood that the two men leading opposite sides had once considered each other close friends. Their conflict was never simply good against evil. It was two people who loved the same cause arguing, sometimes violently, about how best to protect it. Over the decades, this relationship shifted many times. There were periods when Magneto worked alongside the X-Men, even leading them for a time, believing that circumstances required temporary cooperation. There were periods when the two men found common ground, only to be pulled apart again by new crises or new betrayals. Their relationship never resolved into a simple, stable friendship or a simple, stable enmity. It remained, throughout X-Men history, one of the most complicated relationships in the entire Marvel Universe, precisely because both men refused to fully abandon either their old bond or their fundamental disagreement. Understanding this dynamic is essential for understanding much of what follows in this documentary, because so many of the biggest secrets in X-Men history trace back to choices these two men made, separately and together, about how much to trust each other and how much to keep hidden. This deliberate ambiguity around Wolverine's past also shaped how other characters related to him. Teammates learned, over time, not to press him too hard about his history, understanding that even Logan himself often did not know which memories to trust. This created a particular kind of intimacy within the team, built less on shared history than on shared uncertainty, since Wolverine's inability to fully know himself became something the people around him had to accept rather than solve. Chapter 5: The Man Who Couldn't Remember His Own Past. Few mysteries in Marvel Comics history lasted as long or mattered as much as the question of who Wolverine actually was before he became Wolverine. For decades after his introduction, Logan existed as a character defined almost entirely by absence. He did not know his real name with certainty. He did not know where he was born. He did not know how old he was or how many decades, possibly more than a century, he had actually lived. This was not simply a stylistic choice to make him mysterious. Within the story itself, Wolverine's missing past was the direct result of deliberate interference. His mind had been tampered with so many times by so many different parties that even the memories he did have could not be fully trusted. Some had been implanted. Some had been erased. Some had been altered just enough to serve someone else's purposes. For years, writers deliberately avoided answering the question of Wolverine's origin, treating the mystery itself as one of the character's most valuable narrative assets. Fans speculated endlessly about where he came from, what his healing factor and claws actually were, and why his memories were so fragmented. This uncertainty became part of the character's appeal. Wolverine was a man defined by violence and instinct in the present, precisely because his past had been taken from him. When pieces of that past did begin to surface, they came slowly and often contradicted each other, which was itself consistent with a character whose memories had been manipulated by multiple, sometimes competing forces. Some revelations came from psychic intrusions by enemies. Some came from old acquaintances resurfacing with claims about who Logan used to be. Some came from Wolverine's own fragmented flashbacks, which were never fully reliable narrators of his own history. This slow unveiling eventually connected to one of the most important secret organizations in Wolverine's history, the Weapon X program, a covert operation responsible for turning Logan into the weaponized soldier readers came to know, complete with an adamantium skeleton bonded through an excruciating and involuntary procedure. Understanding Weapon X requires understanding that Wolverine did not choose the process that made him who he became. It was done to him, without meaningful consent, by people who saw him as a resource to be engineered rather than a person to be respected. The full horror of Weapon X was not simply that it happened, but that it was allowed to happen through layers of institutional distance, with different scientists and administrators each responsible for only a small piece of the overall procedure. This structure meant that no single person within the program needed to fully reckon with the cumulative cruelty of what was being done to Logan, a pattern of diffused responsibility that echoes uncomfortably with real-world institutional abuses, and that later stories used deliberately to comment on the dangers of bureaucratized violence. Chapter 6: The Weapon X Program. Weapon X was a covert operation, government-affiliated in some depictions and independently run in others depending on the story, dedicated to creating enhanced operatives out of mutants and other test subjects. Wolverine was its most famous product, but he was never its only one. The program experimented on multiple subjects, using invasive procedures, memory manipulation, and psychological conditioning to produce operatives who could be controlled and deployed as living weapons. The most famous element of Wolverine's time in Weapon X was the process that bonded adamantium, a nearly indestructible metal alloy, to his skeleton and claws. This procedure was performed without meaningful consent, using Logan's already present healing factor to keep him alive through an ordeal that would have killed almost anyone else. The pain of the process, and the trauma surrounding it, became one of the defining images in all of Wolverine's history once it was finally depicted in detail. Just as significant as the physical procedure was the psychological conditioning that accompanied it. Weapon X did not simply want a durable soldier. It wanted an obedient one. The program used memory manipulation and psychological conditioning to suppress Logan's personality, turning him into something closer to a weapon that could be pointed at a target and activated, rather than an autonomous person with his own judgment and morality. This conditioning explains a great deal about Wolverine's behavior in the years immediately following his time in the program. His feral, animalistic tendencies were not simply a natural personality trait. They were, at least in part, the result of deliberate suppression of his sense of self, carried out by people who found a more controllable version of Logan more useful than the actual man. Escaping Weapon X did not mean escaping its consequences. For years afterward, Wolverine struggled with fragmented memories, unpredictable rage, and a persistent uncertainty about which parts of his mind were genuinely his own. Other characters, including Xavier, occasionally used their own telepathic abilities to manage or stabilize Wolverine's mental state, which, while sometimes helpful in the moment, added yet another layer of external interference on top of an already damaged sense of identity. The full picture of Weapon X, including its connections to a much larger and older program called Weapon Plus, would not become clear until much later in Wolverine's publication history. We will return to that broader program in a later chapter, once we have covered more of the personal history that Weapon X was built on top of. Because different eras of Wolverine's publication history approached this rivalry with different assumptions about how much of his past was fixed, readers looking for a single, definitive account of the Wolverine and Sabretooth relationship will find instead a layered, sometimes contradictory record, one that reflects the character's fundamentally unstable relationship with his own history more accurately than any single tidy explanation could. Chapter 7: Sabretooth and the Shadow Around Logan. Few relationships in Wolverine's history carry as much unresolved mystery as his connection to Sabretooth. For years, the two characters were positioned as bitter enemies with a long, violent history, but the exact nature of that history remained frustratingly unclear, in large part because Wolverine himself could not reliably remember it. Various stories suggested that Wolverine and Sabretooth had crossed paths repeatedly across different decades, sometimes as enemies, sometimes in more ambiguous circumstances tied to covert operations and government programs. Because so much of Wolverine's memory during these periods was unreliable, some of these accounts contradicted each other, reflecting the reality that different writers were working with an intentionally incomplete puzzle rather than a single, fixed continuity. At various points, stories floated a possible family connection between the two characters, though this idea was never treated as fully settled continuity across the whole line of X-Men comics, and some later stories walked back or complicated that suggestion. Rather than presenting a single confident answer here, it's worth simply noting that Wolverine and Sabretooth's shared history has been one of the more famously tangled and retconned relationships in the franchise, and different eras of the comics have offered different, sometimes conflicting, pictures of exactly how their paths first crossed. What stayed consistent across most versions of the story was the emotional core. Sabretooth represented an aspect of violence and cruelty that Wolverine feared he might become if he ever fully lost control of himself. Their rivalry was not simply about physical combat. It was about the discomfort of recognizing something familiar and unwanted in an enemy's brutality. This uncertainty was, in its own way, thematically appropriate. Wolverine's entire history is defined by unreliable memory and contested truth. His relationship with Sabretooth reflected that same instability, refusing to resolve into a single, tidy explanation, even decades after both characters had become fixtures of the X-Men mythology. The Dark Phoenix saga's ending carried weight far beyond the X-Men's own corner of the Marvel Universe. Alien empires, cosmic tribunals, and figures well outside Earth's usual roster of heroes and villains became involved in judging what had happened, elevating the stakes of the story to a scale that few X-Men narratives before or since have matched. This cosmic scope was part of what made the story's eventual tragic ending feel so significant to readers at the time. Chapter 8: The Bird That Would Not Die. When Jean Grey first joined the original team of X-Men, she was introduced as a talented young telepath and telekinetic, one of Xavier's earliest students. For years, her story followed a relatively conventional path for a superhero of her era. She fought alongside her teammates, developed a long, complicated romance with Cyclops, and slowly grew into one of the most powerful psychic figures in the entire team. That changed dramatically during what became known as the Phoenix Saga. During a dangerous mission that exposed her to intense cosmic radiation, Jean's powers were transformed and amplified to a degree far beyond anything she, or her teammates, had previously understood. She began to manifest abilities on a cosmic scale and took on the identity of Phoenix, becoming one of the most powerful beings in the Marvel Universe. What followed was one of the most influential storylines in the history of superhero comics. Jean's newfound power gradually corrupted her, or was manipulated by outside forces, depending on the interpretation, culminating in a period where she operated under the identity of Dark Phoenix. In that state, she was responsible for an act of destruction on a truly cosmic scale, an event so significant that it drew the attention of alien empires and cosmic tribunals, who judged that she needed to be held accountable for what had happened. The Dark Phoenix saga ended with Jean's death, a moment that stunned readers and became one of the most famous events in the history of the medium. For years afterward, Jean Grey remained dead, and the Phoenix identity was treated as a tragic chapter that had been closed, if a devastating one. Then Jean Grey returned, and the reveal that followed would completely change how readers understood everything that had come before. Later creative teams have periodically revisited the Phoenix mythology with an eye toward reconciling its many, sometimes contradictory depictions. Some stories emphasize the Phoenix as an impersonal cosmic force, indifferent to individual identity. Others emphasized a deep, almost romantic bond between the entity and Jean Grey specifically, suggesting a connection that went beyond simple possession. Both interpretations continue to appear in different corners of Marvel storytelling, and readers should understand the mythology as an ongoing, layered conversation, rather than a single settled answer. Chapter 9: What the Phoenix Really Is. Years after Jean Grey's death during the Dark Phoenix saga, a major retcon revealed that the character who had died, and who had committed the destructive acts associated with Dark Phoenix, had not actually been Jean Grey at all. According to this retcon, the Phoenix Force, a cosmic entity associated with life, death, and rebirth, had created a duplicate of Jean during the original cosmic incident, using that duplicate as a kind of avatar while the real Jean Grey was placed into a protective cocoon to heal. This meant that the being who became Dark Phoenix, and who died at the conclusion of that story, was the Phoenix Force itself, wearing Jean's form and believing itself to genuinely be her. The real Jean Grey was later discovered alive, having survived the entire ordeal in a dormant state, unaware of the events that had unfolded in her name. This retcon was significant and also controversial among longtime readers, because it complicated the emotional impact of the original Dark Phoenix saga. The story had originally worked, in large part, because Jean herself was held responsible for what Dark Phoenix had done, and her death carried the weight of a tragic hero unable to escape the corruption of her own power. The retcon shifted that responsibility onto a separate cosmic entity, which some readers felt reduced the moral complexity of the original story, even as it allowed for Jean's eventual return. Over the following decades, the relationship between Jean Grey and the Phoenix Force continued to be explored and reinterpreted many times. The Phoenix was established as an ancient cosmic force tied to the natural cycle of death and rebirth across the universe, one that had bonded with multiple hosts throughout history, not exclusively with Jean. Other characters, including at different points members of the X-Men themselves, took on aspects of the Phoenix Force in later stories, each exploring different facets of what the entity actually represented. This ongoing reinterpretation reflects one of the defining features of X-Men continuity as a whole. Rather than settling on a single permanent explanation, the Phoenix mythology kept expanding, with later writers building on, and sometimes contradicting, what earlier writers had established. Readers who want a single, simple answer to the question of what the Phoenix Force actually is will not find one in the comics. What they will find instead is a decades-long conversation between different creative teams, each adding new layers to one of the strangest and most cosmic corners of X-Men lore. What remains constant across nearly every version of the story is the core emotional idea. Jean Grey's relationship with the Phoenix Force has always been about the tension between having genuinely limitless power and remaining a person capable of compassion, restraint, and love. That tension, more than any specific plot mechanic, is why the Phoenix mythology has remained central to X-Men storytelling for so many decades. The eventual, fuller acknowledgement of Mystique and Destiny's relationship also allowed later writers to revisit earlier stories with fresh eyes, finding emotional weight in scenes that had previously read as purely tactical. A mission Mystique undertook seemingly for political reasons could be reread as an act of devotion. A risk she took that seemed reckless in isolation made more sense once understood as a response to something Destiny had foreseen. This retrospective deepening is one of the more rewarding aspects of long-running serialized fiction, where later context can meaningfully change the emotional resonance of earlier chapters. Chapter 10: The Woman Who Could See Tomorrow. Mystique, the shape-shifting mutant capable of perfectly mimicking any person's appearance, spent decades operating as one of the X-Men's most persistent and unpredictable adversaries. For much of that time, one of the most important relationships in her life remained largely in the background of the main narrative: her long partnership with Destiny, a mutant precognitive capable of seeing possible futures. Destiny's precognition made her one of the most quietly influential figures in the entire X-Men mythology, because she could see, at least in part, the paths that events might take. Her guidance shaped many of Mystique's decisions over the years, including choices about which battles to fight, which alliances to form, and which risks to avoid. For a long time, however, the depth of the bond between the two women was left largely implicit, a product of the era's restrictions on depicting relationships that were more clearly acknowledged in later years. As X-Men comics moved into eras with more freedom to depict their relationship openly, it became clear that Mystique and Destiny had shared a deep, long-term partnership, one of the most significant relationships in either woman's life. This context reframed many of Mystique's earlier actions, revealing decisions that had once seemed purely tactical as also deeply personal, shaped by her devotion to Destiny and her instinct to protect their family. That family included Rogue, who was raised for a time by Mystique before eventually joining the X-Men. The relationship between Mystique and Rogue remained one of the most complicated in the entire franchise, oscillating between real affection and profound betrayal, as the two women found themselves on opposite sides of the ongoing conflict between mutants and humanity more than once. Destiny's precognitive visions also connected to broader mutant history in ways that were not fully appreciated until much later. She was said to have recorded prophecies about the future of mutant kind, information that later became relevant during the era of Krakoa, when the mutant nation sought out any recorded knowledge that might help guide its own uncertain future. Her diaries, referenced in various stories over the years, became an object of interest for multiple factions who wanted to know what she had foreseen. Understanding Mystique and Destiny's partnership adds emotional depth to decades of X-Men stories that, on the surface, appeared to be straightforward conflicts between heroes and villains. Underneath many of those conflicts was a much quieter story about two women trying to protect each other and their family in a world that offered them very little safety. Sinister's willingness to operate across such enormous timescales also gave him a peculiar kind of patience that few other villains in the Marvel Universe could match. He rarely needed a plan to succeed immediately. He needed only for it to eventually succeed, at some point across a span of decades or centuries, which allowed him to absorb setbacks that would have ended a less patient adversary's ambitions entirely. This patience made him uniquely difficult for the X-Men to permanently defeat, since victories against Sinister in any given story rarely addressed the full scope of what he was actually working toward. Chapter 11: The Geneticist in the Shadows. Few villains in Marvel Comics have operated with the sheer patience of Mr. Sinister. Behind his theatrical appearance and his obsession with genetics, Nathaniel Essex represents one of the longest cons in the history of the X-Men, a plan that stretched across generations and touched nearly every major mutant bloodline in the franchise. Sinister's origins trace back to the 19th century, where Nathaniel Essex was a scientist whose obsession with evolution and genetic potential led him into contact with Apocalypse, the ancient mutant who would become one of his most significant influences. Through this connection, and through his own experiments, Essex transformed himself into the immortal, genetically unstable being who would come to be known as Mr. Sinister. Sinister's central obsession involved the genetic potential of mutant kind, and in particular the Summers and Grey family bloodlines, which he believed carried the key to producing an almost unimaginably powerful mutant offspring. Over the course of more than a century, Sinister manipulated events from behind the scenes, arranging circumstances, influencing relationships, and in some cases directly interfering with the lives of Cyclops' ancestors and descendants, all in pursuit of a genetic outcome that would not become clear until generations later. This long game connected Sinister to an enormous number of major X-Men storylines, often in ways that were not obvious until much later. His fingerprints could be found on events involving Cyclops' family history, the creation and manipulation of various clones, and his ongoing rivalry with Apocalypse, whom he simultaneously served and sought to eventually surpass. Sinister's operation was never a single scheme with a single goal. It was closer to a decades-long research project, conducted with the patience of someone who had effectively unlimited time and was willing to let events play out across multiple generations of a family before acting on what he learned. This patience made him one of the more unsettling villains in the X-Men's rogues gallery, not because of overwhelming physical power, but because of the sheer scope of his willingness to manipulate lives. He considered merely useful data points in a much longer experiment. By the time later stories fully connected the threads of Sinister's long game, readers were able to look back at decades of seemingly unrelated events involving the Summers and Gray families and recognize a single, patient hand guiding many of them from the shadows. Corsair's years as a space pirate, operating among the stars while his sons believed him dead on Earth, added a particularly poignant dimension to the family's eventual reunion. Cyclops had spent years processing his father's apparent death, shaping his own identity and leadership style partly in response to that loss, only to eventually learn that his father had been alive the entire time, living an entirely different life among the stars. This kind of delayed, complicated reunion recurred throughout the Summers family's history, suggesting that loss and rediscovery had become, in a sense, a defining rhythm of the family's story. Chapter 12. A family scattered across time. Few families in Marvel Comics have a history as tangled as the Summers family. What began as a relatively simple backstory for Cyclops, involving a plane crash that separated him and his brother from their parents, eventually expanded into one of the most complicated, time-spanning family trees in the entire X-Men mythology. Cyclops and his brother, who would become Havoc, survived that childhood plane crash and were placed in an orphanage, unaware for years of what had actually happened to their parents. It was later revealed that their father, Christopher Summers, had survived the incident and been taken into space, eventually becoming a space pirate known as Corsair, operating among the stars for years while his sons grew up on Earth believing him dead. The family tree grew even more complicated with the discovery of additional siblings. A third Summers brother, Vulcan, was eventually revealed, a mutant whose existence and abilities had been hidden for years, tied to secrets involving the Shi'ar Empire and Xavier's own past involvement with events surrounding the family that most of Cyclops' teammates knew nothing about. Cyclops' relationship with Jean Grey added another layer of complexity when their descendant, Nathan Summers, was sent forward in time as an infant to escape a deadly techno-organic virus. Raised in a dystopian future, Nathan eventually returned to the present as the adult mutant known as Cable, a soldier-like figure whose complicated relationship with time travel repeatedly intersected with his own family's unresolved history. Cyclops' relationship with an alternate future version of Jean Grey, known as Rachel Summers, added yet another branch to the family tree. Rachel originated in a dystopian alternate future defined by Sentinel oppression, and her arrival in the primary timeline created complicated questions about identity, memory, and family that echoed many of the same themes explored elsewhere in Wolverine's and Jean's stories. Untangling the full Summers family history requires care, because different branches of the family were introduced across different decades, often written by different creative teams working with different understandings of prior continuity. Time travel, alternate futures, and interstellar politics involving the Shi'ar Empire all intersect within this single family story, making it one of the most demanding pieces of continuity in the entire X-Men franchise to fully reconstruct. What holds the family together, thematically, is a recurring pattern of loss, separation, and eventual reunion, often complicated by cosmic or temporal forces well beyond any single family member's control. The Summers family became, over decades of storytelling, a kind of living embodiment of X-Men continuity itself. Sprawling, retconned, occasionally contradictory, and yet held together by genuine emotional through-lines that kept readers invested even as the details grew increasingly intricate. The Hellfire Club's willingness to operate through economic and political influence, rather than direct confrontation, made it a difficult adversary for the X-Men to combat using their usual methods. A team built around physical confrontation with costumed villains found itself, in stories involving the inner circle, navigating boardrooms, social events, and political maneuvering instead. A shift in tone that added variety to the franchise's usual rhythms while underscoring how much power in the Marvel Universe operates outside of costumed combat entirely. Chapter 13: The Hellfire Club's Inner Circle. On its public face, the Hellfire Club appeared to be little more than an exclusive, aristocratic social organization, a private club for the wealthy and influential. Beneath that public face operated the Inner Circle, a secret society of powerful mutants who used the club's resources and connections to pursue influence over global events, often in direct opposition to the X-Men's goals. Sebastian Shaw, one of the Inner Circle's most prominent leaders, possessed the mutant ability to absorb kinetic energy, making him a formidable physical threat as well as a shrewd political operator. Under his leadership and that of other Inner Circle members, the Hellfire Club became deeply entangled in several major X-Men storylines, including its involvement in the events that led to the Dark Phoenix saga, where Inner Circle manipulation played a significant role in destabilizing Jean Grey during her transformation. Emma Frost, initially introduced as one of the Hellfire Club's most formidable telepaths and a recurring antagonist for the X-Men, eventually underwent one of the more significant character transformations in the franchise's history, moving from adversary to eventual ally and X-Men member. Her history within the Inner Circle, and the secrets she carried from that period, continued to inform her character long after she changed sides. The Hellfire Club structure, with its layered ranks and titles borrowed from chess pieces, reflected its members' self-image as players in a much larger game of global influence. Their willingness to manipulate mutant and human politics alike, often through economic and political pressure rather than direct combat, made them a different kind of threat than the X-Men typically faced, one rooted in institutional power rather than open confrontation. The Shadow King's recurring pattern of possession, moving quietly from host to host, meant that his defeats were rarely permanent in the way readers might expect from a more conventional villain. Characters who believed they had finally destroyed him were sometimes confronted, years later, with the unsettling realization that he had simply relocated, patiently waiting for another opportunity. This recurring uncertainty about whether Farouk had truly been dealt with made him one of the more persistently unsettling threats in X-Men history. Chapter 14: The Shadow King. Few X-Men adversaries carry as much quiet psychological horror as the Shadow King, the true identity of Amal Farouk, an ancient and immensely powerful psychic entity. Long before Xavier became the world's most famous telepath, Farouk had already spent decades, by some accounts far longer, exercising psychic influence and outright possession over other minds. Xavier's early history included a direct confrontation with Farouk on the astral plane, a psychic battle that established the two as long-term rivals. Farouk's ability to possess other people's bodies, moving from host to host across years and even decades, made him an unusually persistent threat, one that could resurface long after he seemed to have been defeated. The Shadow King's presence within X-Men lore often functioned less like a conventional supervillain conflict and more like a slow-building psychological horror story. His victims frequently did not realize they were being influenced or possessed until well after the damage had already been done, and his ability to hide within other people's identities made him one of the more unsettling recurring threats in the franchise's history. The reduced mutant population following M-Day also reshaped the internal politics of mutant kind itself. With so few new mutants being born in the years that followed, existing mutants took on an outsized cultural and symbolic significance, and questions about who counted as a legitimate protector or representative of the shrinking population became far more charged than they had been when mutants numbered in the millions. This scarcity, more than any single villain, became one of the defining pressures shaping X-Men storytelling for the following decade. Chapter 15: The Reality That Wasn't Real. House of M began with a personal crisis. Scarlet Witch, a powerful reality-warping mutant, had suffered a series of devastating personal losses that destabilized her already unstable command over probability itself. In response, she reshaped reality entirely, creating a world in which mutants were the dominant population on Earth, and her father, Magneto, ruled over a global mutant empire. Within this altered reality, many X-Men characters lived out lives shaped by their deepest wishes, unaware that the world around them had been artificially constructed. Wolverine, notably, was one of the few characters who retained his original memories throughout the House of M reality, a detail that became significant both narratively and for what it revealed about the durability, or lack of durability, of his already fragmented sense of self. When the altered reality was eventually undone and the original timeline restored, the most consequential secret of House of M was not the illusion itself, but its aftermath. As part of undoing the reality warp, Scarlet Witch depowered the vast majority of the world's mutant population in an event that became known as M-Day, reducing mutant kind from millions of individuals to a small population numbering in the low hundreds almost overnight. This event reshaped the entire scope of X-Men storytelling for years afterward. Mutants, already a persecuted minority, became an endangered population in the literal sense, and stories throughout the following era grappled directly with questions of extinction, scarcity, and survival that had previously existed mostly as metaphor. The consequences of House of M, in other words, mattered far more than the fantastical reality that gave the story its name, and those consequences would echo for more than a decade of subsequent storytelling. Apocalypse's recurring selections of horsemen also served a narrative purpose beyond simple villainy, since the characters he corrupted or empowered often carried their transformations with them long after breaking free of his influence. This meant that Apocalypse's impact on the wider X-Men cast frequently outlasted any single storyline, leaving marks on characters that other writers would continue to explore for years afterward. Chapter 16: The First Mutant. Apocalypse, also known by his original name N'Sabah, is presented within Marvel continuity as one of the very first mutants to have ever existed, born in ancient Egypt with abilities that made him appear almost godlike to those around him. His guiding philosophy, often summarized as survival of the fittest, positions him not as a conventional villain seeking power for its own sake, but as something closer to a self-appointed force of natural selection, convinced that only the strongest deserve to shape the future. Over thousands of years, Apocalypse gathered advanced technology, some of it connected to the alien Celestials, using it to extend his life and enhance his abilities far beyond what natural mutation alone could produce. His recurring selection of horsemen, champions empowered and transformed to serve his cause, became one of his most consistent narrative devices, frequently drawing in X-Men characters who were manipulated, coerced, or corrupted into serving his purposes. Apocalypse's connection to Mr. Sinister added another layer to his long history, since Sinister's obsession with genetics and evolution had originally been shaped by his contact with Apocalypse centuries earlier. This relationship, one of mutual use rather than simple loyalty, tied two of the X-Men's most patient, long-term villains together across a shared, overlapping history that stretch back long before either character's first appearance in modern comics. Later stories, particularly during the Krakoa era, reframed Apocalypse's role within mutant society in surprising ways, positioning him at times as an ally, or at least a complicated participant, in the mutant nation's broader goals. This shift reflected a recurring pattern in Apocalypse's characterization. Rather than being motivated by pure destruction, his central concern has always been the long-term survival and evolutionary strength of mutant kind as a species, a goal that, at different points, has aligned him with and against the X-Men in equal measure. The recurring image of Sentinels looming over a devastated future, first established in Days of Future Past and echoed in numerous stories since, became one of the most visually and thematically enduring symbols in the entire X-Men franchise. Its persistence across decades of storytelling and across different media adaptations speaks to how effectively the concept captured a particular anxiety, that the tools built to manage a feared minority tend, over time, to escape the control of the people who built them. Chapter 17: The Secret History of the Sentinels. The Sentinels began as an idea born from human fear. Designed initially by the scientist Bolivar Trask as a means of detecting and neutralizing mutant threats, the giant robotic hunters quickly became one of the most enduring symbols of anti-mutant persecution in the entire X-Men mythology. Their existence embodied one of the franchise's central anxieties, that humanity's fear of mutants could easily escalate into large-scale mechanized violence. As Sentinel technology evolved across decades of stories, the robots grew increasingly sophisticated, eventually developing rudimentary independent intelligence in some story arcs. Master Mold, an early Sentinel command unit, was designed to construct and direct additional Sentinels autonomously, raising uncomfortable questions about how much human control over the technology could ever really be guaranteed once it reached a certain level of sophistication. This anxiety proved well-founded in later stories. Nimrod, a highly advanced Sentinel originating from a dystopian alternate future, represented an even more dangerous evolution of the technology, adaptive and nearly impossible to permanently destroy. Bastion, a being combining human and Sentinel technology, extended this same fear even further, blurring the line between human anti-mutant zealotry and machine efficiency in a single, deeply dangerous adversary. Across all of these iterations, the Sentinels functioned as more than simply recurring antagonists. They represented an ongoing meditation on the risks of building tools of persecution and control, and the difficulty of ever fully containing those tools once they were unleashed. This theme would resurface directly during the modern era of Orchis, an organization whose anti-mutant strategy drew heavily on Sentinel-adjacent technology and philosophy, which we will examine later in this documentary. Understanding Weapon Plus as an ongoing institutional project, rather than a single isolated experiment, also changes how readers should understand Wolverine's own recovery. His healing was never simply about escaping a single facility or defeating a single group of captors. It involved slowly untangling himself from an institutional pattern that had been operating, in various forms, for far longer than his own involvement with it, a pattern that other characters would continue to encounter in entirely separate stories for years afterward. Chapter 18: Weapon Plus, the program behind the program. For years, Weapon X appeared to be a self-contained covert operation responsible for Wolverine's transformation. Later stories revealed a much larger structure behind it: Weapon Plus, an ongoing, multi-generational program dedicated to creating superhuman operatives, of which Weapon X was only one iteration among many. Weapon Plus's history was retroactively connected to some of the earliest superhuman experiments in the Marvel Universe, including programs that predated Wolverine's own transformation by decades. This connection tied Weapon X into a much broader, darker tradition of governmental and quasi-governmental experimentation on both mutants and non-mutants alike. framing Wolverine's ordeal as one especially brutal chapter within a much longer, colder institutional history. Later iterations of the Weapon Plus program continued to appear in various corners of X-Men and broader Marvel storytelling, each one exploring different ethical and philosophical dimensions of the same core idea: the willingness of powerful institutions to treat individual mutants, and individual people generally, as raw material for weapons development, with little regard for consent or long-term consequences. Revisiting Wolverine's ordeal with this broader context in mind reframes his suffering as part of a much larger systemic pattern rather than an isolated incident. Chapter 19: The Woman Who Had Lived 10 Lives. For most of X-Men history, Moira MacTaggert was known as a brilliant human geneticist, one of Charles Xavier's closest friends, and for a time, his fiancée. She ran a research facility dedicated to studying mutation, worked alongside the X-Men on numerous occasions, and was treated for decades as one of the most important human allies mutant kind had ever had. Her death, which occurred years before the revelation we are about to discuss, was treated at the time as a permanent, meaningful loss. Then, decades after her introduction, a single storyline completely rewrote everything readers thought they understood about who Moira MacTaggert actually was. It was revealed that Moira was not, in fact, a normal human being. She was a mutant herself, one whose mutant power had never been previously depicted or even hinted at in prior stories, because its nature made it almost impossible to notice from the outside. Moira's mutation allowed her to be reborn after death, retaining the memories of all her previous lives, effectively allowing her to live through the same general period of history over and over again, learning from each attempt and applying that knowledge to the next. This retcon reframed Moira's entire history. She was not simply a scientist who happened to be close to Xavier. She was someone who had already lived through the entire span of mutant history, in one form or another, multiple times over, using the knowledge gained from each life to make different choices in the next. Some of her lives ended in failure, with mutant kind wiped out entirely by human aggression or by other catastrophic events. Other lives ended with different outcomes, each one teaching her something new about the mistakes and possibilities available to mutant civilization. The revelation also completely changed the meaning of Moira's relationship with Xavier and Magneto. In the life readers had originally followed, her relationship with Xavier had seemed to be simply a personal one, a romance and friendship that existed alongside the larger X-Men narrative. Once her true nature was revealed, that relationship took on a new dimension. Moira had, across her different lives, worked with both Xavier and Magneto, sometimes together and sometimes separately, testing different strategies for ensuring mutant kind's survival, using her foreknowledge in ways that neither man had ever fully understood while it was happening. It is important to be precise about what this revelation actually changed, since the retcon was carefully constructed to avoid outright contradicting most of Moira's previously established appearances. In the version of events readers had originally followed, Moira genuinely was the human scientist and ally she appeared to be. The retcon reframed that life as merely her latest one, adding an entirely new layer of context underneath events that had already been told, rather than erasing or rewriting the events themselves. This distinction mattered enormously to how the revelation was received, since it allowed decades of prior stories to remain essentially intact while dramatically deepening their meaning. The revelation also connected directly to the founding of Krakoa. According to this new context, Moira had used the accumulated knowledge of her previous lives to guide Xavier and Magneto toward founding the mutant nation of Krakoa, believing that this specific approach, mutant sovereignty, biological resurrection, and careful political maneuvering, represented the best chance mutant kind had ever had at long-term survival, based on outcomes she had already witnessed and rejected in prior lives. This connection meant that the entire Krakoa era, one of the most significant shifts in X-Men storytelling in decades, was built on a foundation that readers did not fully understand until the truth about Moira was revealed. Xavier and Magneto's uncharacteristic cooperation, their willingness to set aside decades of ideological conflict in pursuit of a shared mutant nation, made a great deal more sense once it became clear that a third party, one with far more information than either of them, had been quietly guiding their decisions. The revelation also raised uncomfortable questions that the comics did not shy away from exploring. If Moira had lived through mutant history many times before, how many of her choices had been made with a kind of foreknowledge that neither Xavier, Magneto, nor any other mutant could match? Was her guidance a gift, given freely out of genuine care for mutant-kind survival, or was it another form of the same pattern we saw earlier with Xavier? A powerful individual making enormous decisions on behalf of others without fully explaining her reasoning or her true capabilities. These questions became especially charged once other characters within the story eventually learned the truth about Moira. Some reacted with understanding, recognizing the impossible burden of carrying the memory of so many failed attempts at mutant survival. Others reacted with suspicion, uncomfortable with the idea that so much of Krakoa's founding vision had been shaped by someone whose true nature and true motivations had been deliberately concealed from nearly everyone involved. Moira's true nature also connected to a broader pattern we have already seen throughout this documentary. Xavier hid things from his students. Sinister hid his long game from generations of the Summers and Grey families. Mystique and Destiny operated with knowledge others did not have access to. Moira's revelation fit into this same larger theme, showing once again that some of the most consequential decisions in X-Men history were made by individuals who understood far more about the true stakes than the people standing right next to them. By the time the Krakoa era reached its later stages, and eventually its collapse, which we will discuss in a later chapter, Moira's true nature had become one of the defining pieces of context necessary to fully understand the mutant nation's rise and fall. What had once seemed like a relatively straightforward story about mutant sovereignty turned out to be the latest chapter in an extraordinarily long, carefully guided experiment, run by someone who had already watched mutant-kind story end many times before, and who was determined, this time, to get it right. The living nature of Krakoa itself introduced questions that the mutant nation's leadership rarely addressed directly in public. If the island was a sentient being, capable of communication and cooperation with its mutant inhabitants, what obligations did the nation actually owe to it in return for the extraordinary resources it provided? This question remained largely in the background of most Krakoa-era storytelling, but it added a quiet, unresolved tension beneath the nation's public triumphs, one that echoed the franchise's broader, recurring discomfort with power that comes from sources not fully understood or accounted for. Chapter 20. The Island That Thought for Itself. When Krakoa emerged as a mutant nation, most of the outside world understood it as a striking political development. Mutants, for the first time in their history, claiming an actual sovereign homeland, a living island in the Pacific willing to shelter them from a hostile world. What was not immediately obvious, even to many of the mutants who moved there, was the sheer scale of planning and concealment that had gone into making Krakoa possible. Krakoa itself was revealed to be a mutant, a sentient island whose biology could be harnessed to produce extraordinary resources, from advanced medicines to instantaneous transportation, through a network of specially grown gateways. This living infrastructure allowed the new mutant nation to offer something no human government could easily match, and it quickly became one of Krakoa's most significant sources of geopolitical leverage. Behind the scenes, Xavier and Magneto had been working together for some time before Krakoa's founding was publicly announced, an alliance that surprised nearly everyone who knew their long history of conflict. As we discussed in the previous chapter, this cooperation only makes full sense once Moira's guiding influence is taken into account, since she had already lived through outcomes in which the two men's rivalry had contributed to mutantkinds' destruction, and worked deliberately to prevent a repeat of those failures this time. The formation of the Quiet Council, Krakoa's ruling body, brought together an unusual assembly of figures, including former adversaries and villains who had rarely, if ever, been trusted with this kind of authority in prior eras. Mr. Sinister's inclusion on the council, given his long history of manipulation and genetic experimentation described earlier in this documentary, was one of the more controversial and uneasy alliances within the new nation, reflecting Krakoa's broader willingness to prioritize mutant unity over settled questions of trust. Krakoa's foreign policy also relied on carefully guarded secrets, particularly around the exact processes behind its most valuable exports and its resurrection protocol. Maintaining strategic ambiguity about exactly how much power the nation possessed and exactly how its most valuable resources were produced became a deliberate tool of Krakoan diplomacy, one that mirrored, on a national scale, the same instinct toward selective disclosure that had defined Xavier's personal decisions for decades. Mystique and Destiny's history connected to Krakoa as well, since Destiny's long-hidden diaries, containing decades of precognitive insight into mutant history, became a subject of significant interest once the mutant nation was established, with various factions seeking access to information that might help guide Krakoa's uncertain future or, in less benevolent hands, help undermine it. Ultimately, Krakoa represented far more than a new headquarters or a new base of operations for the X-Men. It represented an entirely different philosophy, a belief that mutant-kind survival required not just tolerance from humanity, but genuine sovereignty, economic leverage, and most controversially, freedom from death itself, a freedom made possible by the resurrection protocol that we will examine in the next chapter. The resurrection protocol also had significant implications for how mutants approached risk and self-sacrifice. Knowing that death was, in principle, reversible changed the psychological calculus behind dangerous missions, sometimes encouraging bolder action, and sometimes producing a strange kind of complacency about mortality that some characters found deeply unsettling rather than comforting. Several stories during this era explored characters who found themselves paralyzed by the philosophical weight of near immortality rather than liberated by it, unable to fully reconcile the safety net of resurrection with their instinctive, deeply human fear of death. Chapter 21. The Secret Behind Mutant Resurrection. Perhaps no single innovation defined the Krakoa era as thoroughly as its resurrection protocol, a system that allowed deceased mutants to be restored to life using a combination of genetic backups, stored psychic patterns, and cloned bodies. On the surface, this appeared to be a straightforward, almost utopian solution to mutant-kind's long history of loss. In practice, the process raised profound philosophical and ethical questions that the comics explored in considerable depth. The resurrection protocol depended on a specific group of 5 mutants, known as the Five, whose combined abilities allowed them to grow a new body from a genetic template, restore psychic backups of the deceased mutant's memories and personality, and revive the resulting body as a fully functioning person. These genetic backups were collected regularly through Cerebro, which we will discuss further in the next chapter, essentially creating a continuously updated archive of nearly every mutant mind on Krakoa. The philosophical implications of this system ran deep. If a person's body could be regrown and their memories restored from a backup taken at some earlier point, what exactly happened to their sense of continuous identity? Characters resurrected in this way sometimes grappled with the unsettling awareness that they were, in a very real sense, a copy built from a snapshot of themselves, missing any memories formed between that backup and their actual death. For characters who died suddenly, this gap might be small. For others, particularly those who had gone a long time without updating their psychic backup, the gap could represent a meaningful, permanent loss of lived experience. The system also raised uncomfortable questions about consent and control. Access to resurrection, at least in principle, was meant to be available to all Krakoan citizens, but the process itself was controlled by a relatively small group of individuals and overseen by the Quiet Council, giving those in power significant influence over who could return from death and under what circumstances. This created an obvious potential for abuse, since the ability to grant or withhold resurrection carried enormous political weight within Krakoan society. Perhaps most unsettling of all was the question of what happened when the process went wrong, or was deliberately misused. Various stories during the Krakoa era explored scenarios involving multiple copies of the same person, resurrected without full transparency about how many versions of themselves might exist, or people confronting the psychological weight of remembering their own death and subsequent rebirth as a lived, if traumatic, experience rather than an abstract medical procedure. Taken together, the resurrection protocol forced both the characters and the readers to reconsider what death actually meant for mutant kind. If death could reliably be reversed, at least for those with access to Krakoa's resources, then many of the emotional and narrative stakes that had defined X-Men storytelling for decades needed to be reconsidered. The comics did not shy away from this challenge, repeatedly returning to stories about grief, identity, and the strange, unresolved feeling of loving someone who has died and returned, possibly changed by the experience in ways they cannot fully articulate. The concentration of so much sensitive information within a single system also made Cerebro an obvious target for anyone seeking to undermine Krakoa from within or from without. Control over the machine, and over the vast archive of mutant minds it maintained, represented one of the single greatest points of leverage in the entire mutant nation, a fact that adversaries like Orchis would later seek to exploit as their campaign against Krakoa intensified. Chapter 22, Cerebro's Hidden Role. Cerebro began its existence in the X-Men mythology as a straightforward tool, a machine built by Xavier that amplified his telepathic abilities enough to detect mutants anywhere on the planet. Over the decades, however, Cerebro's role expanded far beyond simple detection, gradually becoming one of the most consequential and quietly dangerous pieces of technology in the entire X-Men mythology. As we discussed earlier in this documentary, Cerebro's true potential extended well beyond locating mutants in danger. In the wrong hands, or even in Xavier's own hands under the wrong circumstances, the machine represented a means of exerting telepathic influence on a scale that few other pieces of technology in the Marvel Universe could match. This risk remained a persistent undercurrent throughout Xavier's use of the device, even during periods when it was used purely for benevolent purposes. During the Krakoa era, Cerebro's function expanded again, this time into something even more significant, a repository for psychic backups used in the mutant resurrection process discussed in the previous chapter. This transformed Cerebro from a detection tool into something closer to a vast, continuously updated archive of mutant consciousness itself, storing snapshots of personality and memory that could later be used to bring someone back from death. This expanded role raised its own set of philosophical questions. A machine capable of storing something as intimate as a person's full psychic pattern carried enormous implications for privacy and autonomy, regardless of the benevolent purpose it was being used for. The comics occasionally touched on the discomfort some characters felt about having their innermost mind effectively backed up and stored, even when they trusted the system's stated purpose. Cerebro's evolution across decades of X-Men storytelling, from a simple detection device to an instrument of mass resurrection, mirrors the broader evolution of the franchise's central themes. What began as a story about finding and protecting a hidden minority gradually became a story about that minority building an entirely new relationship with mortality itself, and Cerebro sat at the center of that transformation the entire time. It is worth emphasizing that these moral compromises rarely went entirely unexamined within the story itself. Various characters, across different eras, openly challenged decisions they viewed as ethically unacceptable, sometimes leaving the team or refusing to participate in specific missions as a result. This internal friction, rather than undermining the X-Men's heroism, arguably reinforced it, showing a team willing to hold itself accountable, however imperfectly, rather than simply accepting that difficult circumstances excused any and all methods. Chapter 23: The X-Men's Secret Moral Compromises. Throughout their history, the X-Men have been presented as heroes, and in most respects they have earned that reputation many times over. But a close look at their history reveals a recurring pattern of moral compromise, decisions made in the name of protecting mutant kind that crossed lines the team did not always openly acknowledge, even among themselves. Xavier's use of telepathy on his own students, discussed earlier in this documentary, represents one of the clearest and most persistent examples. But he was far from the only X-Man willing to make ethically uncomfortable choices under pressure. Various team members, at different points in their history, used psychic interference on enemies in ways that went beyond simple self-defense, extracting information or neutralizing threats through methods that raised uncomfortable questions about consent and proportionality. Beast's story offers another instructive example. Over the decades, Henry McCoy's scientific curiosity led him toward increasingly extreme experiments, some of which had significant unintended consequences, both for himself and for the broader mutant community. His willingness to pursue scientific solutions to mutant problems, sometimes without fully consulting his teammates or considering the long-term risks, echoed, on a smaller scale, some of the same instincts that made Mr. Sinister such a dangerous figure, even though Beast's intentions remained fundamentally different. Krakoa's political structure introduced its own set of morally complicated decisions, particularly around the control of resurrection and the inclusion of former villains like Mr. Sinister within its governing council. The nation's leadership repeatedly faced difficult choices about how much transparency to offer its own citizens, and how much authority to concentrate among a small group of powerful individuals, echoing tensions that had existed within X-Men leadership since the earliest days of Xavier's original vision. None of these moral compromises are presented within the comics themselves as simple villainy. They exist instead as an ongoing exploration of the difficulty of doing genuine good under conditions of persecution and existential threat. The X-Men have never been written as perfect heroes making uniformly correct decisions. They have been written as people, occasionally very powerful people, forced to make imperfect choices under pressure, and living with the uncomfortable consequences of those choices for years, sometimes decades afterward. The recurring uncertainty about whether these dystopian futures represented fixed destinies or preventable possibilities also mirrored a broader tension found throughout serialized superhero storytelling, where the need for ongoing, dramatic stakes often works against the desire for a clean, permanent resolution. Rather than treating this tension as a flaw, many of the strongest days of future past-inspired stories leaned into it directly, using the ambiguity itself as a source of dread, since a future that might not actually be preventable carries a very different emotional weight than one the heroes can simply avert through sufficient effort. Chapter 24: The Future That Refuses to Stay Fixed. Few concepts have generated as much recurring storytelling in X-Men comics as the various dystopian futures glimpsed throughout the franchise's history. Beginning with the original Days of Future Past storyline, which depicted a devastated future where Sentinels had all but exterminated mutant kind and imprisoned the survivors. These alternate futures became a recurring narrative device, used to explore the consequences of choices being made in the present timeline. Days of Future Past introduced Rachel Summers, whose future origins we discussed earlier in the context of the Summers family, and established a template that later stories would return to repeatedly. A devastated timeline, a handful of survivors, and a desperate attempt to change history before that future could come to pass. Because these stories almost always ended with the timeline being altered or avoided, they raised persistent questions about the stability of time itself within Marvel continuity, and whether any given depiction of the future should be understood as fixed or merely as one possibility among many. Bishop, a mutant lawman from another dystopian future, brought a different perspective to this recurring theme when he traveled to the present, carrying knowledge of events that, from his point of view, had already happened. His presence complicated the X-Men's own sense of their future, since his foreknowledge suggested certain events were more fixed than the team might have hoped, even as other characters, like Cable, operated from a conviction that the future remained fundamentally changeable through sufficient effort and sacrifice. This tension between a future that could be prevented and a future that seemed dishearteningly fixed ran through decades of X-Men storytelling without ever being definitively resolved. Different stories offered different answers, sometimes contradicting each other, which reflected the reality that the concept of time travel in superhero comics tends to serve whatever emotional or thematic purpose a given story needs, rather than adhering to a single, consistent set of rules. What remained constant across nearly every version of these dystopian futures was their underlying warning. Whether caused by escalating Sentinel programs, unchecked anti-mutant legislation, or catastrophic mutant civil war, these glimpses of possible futures consistently reinforced one of the X-Men's central themes: that the ongoing conflict between mutants and humanity carried the real possibility of ending in catastrophe, and that preventing that outcome required active, difficult choices in the present, not passive hope that things would simply work out. What distinguished Orchis from many of the X-Men's more traditional adversaries was the organization's willingness to think in terms of systems and infrastructure rather than individual confrontations. Rather than sending a single powerful agent to attack the X-Men directly, Orchis worked to undermine the foundations that Krakoa's power depended on, targeting its resources, its diplomatic relationships, and its internal cohesion with the same patient, institutional approach that had made programs like Weapon Plus and the original Sentinel initiative so dangerous in earlier decades. Chapter 25: Orchis and the Secret War Against Mutants. As the Krakoa era progressed, a new, more calculated threat emerged from the shadows. Orchis, a secretive organization combining human scientists, government resources, and advanced technology in a coordinated effort to neutralize the growing power of Krakoa and mutant kind more broadly. Unlike many of the X-Men's more theatrical adversaries, Orchis operated with a kind of cold, institutional patience that echoed some of the same anxieties originally represented by the Sentinel program decades earlier. Orchis's most significant creation was a new, highly advanced iteration of Nimrod, the dangerous Sentinel-derived intelligence introduced in earlier decades of X-Men storytelling. This updated version of Nimrod combined predictive intelligence with adaptive combat capability, representing one of the most dangerous anti-mutant weapons ever deployed against Krakoa, precisely because it was designed specifically to counter the mutant nation's unique advantages, including its resurrection protocol. Orchis's strategy relied heavily on secrecy and infiltration, gathering intelligence on Krakoa's inner workings and exploiting divisions within mutant leadership wherever possible. Their eventual large-scale assault on the mutant nation triggered a period that came to be known as the Fall of X, a devastating series of events that fundamentally destabilized Krakoa's position and forced significant portions of its population into direct, desperate conflict for survival. The rise of Orchis brought many of this documentary's earlier themes into direct collision. The Sentinel program's original anxieties about mechanized anti-mutant violence, discussed several chapters ago, found their most advanced and dangerous expression yet. Krakoa's own culture of strategic secrecy, discussed in the chapter on the mutant nation's founding, left it vulnerable in certain respects to an adversary willing to exploit exactly the kind of concealed information the nation had built its foreign policy around. The convergence of so many long-running secrets at this stage of the story underscored just how interconnected X-Men continuity had become by this point in its history. Threads that had been introduced decades apart, Moira's true nature, the Sentinel program's evolution into Orchis, the long-simmering tension between Krakoa's public ideals and its private methods, all arrived at once, forcing both the characters and the readers to reckon with the full weight of everything that had been building quietly beneath the surface for so long. Chapter 26. The Secrets Revealed at the End of Krakoa. As the Krakoa era moved toward its conclusion, several of the secrets discussed throughout this documentary converged in ways that fundamentally reshaped mutant-kind's situation. Moira's guiding influence, once fully understood by the wider mutant population, forced a reckoning with just how much of Krakoa's founding vision had been shaped by someone whose true nature had been deliberately concealed. Some mutants felt a renewed sense of purpose upon learning the full context of Moira's sacrifice across her many lives. Others felt a lingering unease about having been guided, however benevolently, without their full knowledge or consent. The escalating threat from Orchis forced Krakoa's leadership to make increasingly difficult decisions, echoing the same pattern of morally complicated choices discussed earlier in this documentary. Questions about how much information to share with the broader mutant population, how much authority to concentrate among a small governing council, and how far to go in defending the nation against an existential threat, all resurfaced with renewed urgency as the conflict intensified. The eventual destabilization of Krakoa, brought about through the combined pressure of Orchis's assault and the internal tensions the mutant nation had never fully resolved, represented a significant turning point for the X-Men as a whole. It closed one of the most ambitious chapters in the franchise's history, while opening new questions about what mutant-kind's future would look like without the specific advantages and the specific vulnerabilities that had defined the Krakoa era. Taken together, the end of the Krakoa era demonstrated one final time a pattern that had run through nearly every secret discussed in this documentary. Concealed knowledge, however well-intentioned, tends eventually to surface, and when it does, it reshapes not just the characters directly involved, but the entire foundation of the story built on top of it. Chapter 27. The Monster Inside Xavier's Own Mind. Of all the secrets connected to Charles Xavier, few are as unsettling as the revelation that his own repressed rage and trauma could take on a monstrous life of its own. This happened most dramatically in the story of Onslaught, a powerful psionic entity that emerged from a combination of Xavier's darkest, most deeply buried impulses and psychic material drawn from his old rival, Magneto, following a confrontation between the two men. For years, Xavier had suppressed a great deal of anger, resentment, and darker instinct beneath his calm, controlled public persona. This was, in some ways, a natural response to the impossible position he occupied. A man who needed to project hope and stability to his students while privately carrying the weight of decades of loss, betrayal, and difficult decisions. When circumstances allowed that suppressed material to combine with the residue of Magneto's own psychic presence, the result was not simply an outburst of temper. It was an entirely separate, extraordinarily powerful entity, one capable of acting on impulses Xavier had spent his entire life trying to keep contained. Onslaught's rampage forced both the X-Men and the wider Marvel Universe to confront a difficult truth. The same mind capable of building schools, negotiating peace, and dreaming of coexistence was also capable, under the right circumstances, of producing something genuinely monstrous. This was not treated as evidence that Xavier had secretly been evil all along. It was treated as a demonstration of just how much psychological weight he had been carrying in silence, weight that his students and allies had rarely been allowed to see or help him process. The aftermath of the Onslaught crisis carried consequences for Xavier's relationships and reputation that lasted for years afterward. Some characters found it difficult to trust him in quite the same way once they understood what had been hidden beneath his composed exterior. Others viewed the incident with sympathy, recognizing that Xavier had been failed, in his own way, by a culture, both within the X-Men and beyond it, that expected him to serve as a stabilizing figure without ever offering him the same kind of support in return. Chapter 28. The virus that exposed a hidden fear. The legacy virus, a mysterious and initially untraceable illness that began killing mutants across the world, introduced one of the most sustained sources of dread in X-Men storytelling during the 1990s. What made the virus especially unsettling was not simply its lethality, but the uncertainty surrounding its origin, an uncertainty that took years of in-story investigation to resolve. As the mystery deepened, it eventually connected back to Mr. Sinister's long history of genetic experimentation, tying the virus into the same decade-spanning pattern of manipulation discussed earlier in this documentary. The revelation reframed a plague that had initially seemed like a natural, tragic mystery into something far more troubling, a consequence, however unintended, of decades of unchecked genetic tampering carried out by one of the X-Men's most patient and secretive adversaries. The legacy virus storyline also forced the X-Men to grapple with a fear that had always lingered beneath the surface of their world. The possibility that mutant kind might simply be wiped out, not through open war, but through a slow, invisible process that no amount of heroism could easily stop. This fear echoed forward into later stories, including the population collapse caused by M-Day and the existential threats posed by Orchis, forming a through-line of extinction anxiety that ran through decades of X-Men storytelling in different forms. The eventual resolution of the legacy virus crisis came at significant personal cost to several major characters, reinforcing a pattern that recurs throughout X-Men history. Solutions to mutant kind's greatest threats rarely arrive without real sacrifice, and the secrets behind those threats, once uncovered, tend to implicate figures the X-Men already knew, rather than remaining the work of anonymous, external forces. Chapter 29. The original 5 displaced in time. One of the more unusual secrets in recent X-Men history involved the original 5 members of the X-Men, Cyclops, Jean Grey, Beast, Angel, and Iceman, as they existed in their earliest teenage years. A time travel incident brought these younger versions of the characters forward into the present, placing them alongside older versions of themselves who had lived through decades of history the teenagers had not yet experienced. This situation created an unusual kind of secret-keeping, since the adult versions of these characters, along with the rest of the X-Men, had to decide how much of the future to reveal to their younger selves. Telling the teenage Jean Grey about the Phoenix Force, the Dark Phoenix saga, and her own eventual death raised obvious ethical questions about whether that knowledge would help her make better choices or simply burden her with a trauma she had not yet earned. Similarly, the young Cyclops, encountering an older version of himself who had made choices the teenager found genuinely difficult to understand or forgive, was forced to reckon with a version of his own future that felt like a betrayal of the ideals he currently held. This dynamic turned decades of established Cyclops continuity into something the character himself could actively question and push back against, adding a layer of self-aware commentary on how much the character had changed over the course of his long publication history. The eventual resolution of the time-displaced original 5 storyline left several of the younger characters choosing to remain in the present rather than returning to their own time, adding yet another complicated branch to the already tangled question of X-Men continuity and identity that runs throughout this documentary. Chapter 30: The Nation's Secret Black OPS. Beneath Krakoa's public image of hope and mutant flourishing operated a far more secretive apparatus. X-Force, a covert strike team authorized by the Quiet Council to carry out assassinations, sabotage, and other operations too ethically fraught to be conducted in public view. Unlike the X-Men, who operated as a visible symbol of mutant heroism, X-Force existed specifically because Krakoa's leadership recognized that some threats required methods the nation could never publicly acknowledge. The existence of this Black Ops arm complicated Krakoa's utopian image considerably. A mutant nation built on the promise of a better, safer future for all mutants was, simultaneously, authorizing lethal covert operations against its enemies, a contradiction that several characters within the story wrestled with directly. Wolverine and Beast's involvement in X-Force, given their own histories with morally compromised violence discussed earlier in this documentary, added additional weight to the tension between Krakoa's public ideals and its private methods. This arrangement reflected, on an institutional scale, the same pattern that had defined Xavier's personal choices for decades, a belief that certain necessary actions were better carried out quietly, without full transparency, than debated openly and potentially left undone. Whether this approach represented pragmatic necessity or a troubling erosion of Krakoa's founding ideals remained a live question throughout the era, one that the eventual collapse of the mutant nation did little to fully resolve. Chapter 31: The Father Nightcrawler Never Knew. Kurt Wagner, the swashbuckling, deeply religious mutant known as Nightcrawler, spent much of his early history without a clear understanding of his own parentage. Raised believing his mother had abandoned him as an infant because of his demonic appearance, Kurt carried a quiet grief about his origins that shaped much of his search for belonging, both within the X-Men and within his own faith. It was eventually revealed that his mother was Mystique, the shapeshifter whose long partnership with Destiny was discussed earlier in this documentary. This revelation reframed Kurt's entire early life, since Mystique's decision to give him up had not been born from simple rejection, but from a desperate attempt to protect him during a period when her own life and circumstances made raising him seem impossible. The revelation did not erase the pain of Kurt's abandonment, but it complicated it considerably, transforming a simple story of maternal rejection into a much sadder story about impossible choices made under desperate circumstances. His father's identity took even longer to surface, eventually revealed to be Azazel, a mutant with teleportation abilities and a long, secretive history of his own, tied to an ancient lineage of similarly appearing mutants with connections to old legends about demons. This revelation added a mythological dimension to Nightcrawler's origins that had not been present in his earliest appearances, retroactively connecting his story to a much older, stranger thread of mutant history that intersected with figures and organizations most X-Men had never previously encountered. Kurt's reaction to learning the truth about his parents reflected his broader character, a capacity for compassion and forgiveness that many of his teammates found difficult to fully understand, given how much pain his early abandonment had caused him. Rather than responding with lasting bitterness, Kurt worked, gradually and imperfectly, towards some form of reconciliation with Mystique specifically, treating the revelation as an opportunity to understand his mother rather than simply condemn her. Chapter 32. The Girl Who Carried Wolverine's Scars. Laura Kinney, who would become known as X-23, represented one of the most direct continuations of the Weapon X legacy discussed earlier in this documentary. Created as a clone derived from Wolverine's genetic material, Laura was engineered by a successor program seeking to replicate his abilities, including his healing factor and his claws, in a form that could be more directly controlled than Logan himself had ever proven to be. Laura's early life was defined by conditioning even more explicit and deliberate than what Wolverine himself had experienced. Where Logan's personality had been suppressed and manipulated after the fact, Laura was raised from early childhood specifically to become a compliant, weaponized asset, subjected to psychological conditioning designed to strip away empathy and encourage violent obedience. Her eventual escape from this conditioning, and her long, difficult journey toward genuine autonomy and selfhood, mirrored Wolverine's own struggle in an even more explicit and disturbing form. The relationship that eventually developed between Laura and Logan carried significant emotional weight once its full context was understood. Wolverine recognized in her a version of his own exploitation, magnified and made even more calculated, and much of his relationship with her involved an attempt to give her the kind of protection and mentorship that he himself had never received during his own time inside the Weapon X program. Laura's eventual embrace of the Wolverine identity, taking up the mantle after Logan's own death and subsequent return, reflected just how thoroughly her story had grown from a symbol of exploitation into a genuine, hard-won example of reclaimed identity. Chapter 33. The Secret Within Charles Xavier's Own Mind. Xavier's own death, and the questions surrounding his continued presence in the world afterward, added a final, deeply personal secret to a life already defined by concealment. Following his death, later stories revealed that Xavier's consciousness, along with the accumulated knowledge and memory of who he was, had been preserved and eventually restored to a cloned body, a process made possible in part by the same resurrection infrastructure later formalized during the Krakoa era. This revelation raised, in an intensely personal way, the same philosophical questions explored earlier in this documentary regarding mutant resurrection generally. Was the Xavier who returned genuinely the same man who had died, carrying an unbroken thread of identity, or was he, in the same sense as other resurrected Krakoan citizens, a new instance built from a preserved template, distinguishable from the original only by the completeness of his restored memories? Xavier's own history of unilaterally making decisions about other people's minds gave this question an added layer of discomfort. The man who had spent decades deciding, without consultation, what others should and should not remember was now himself the subject of questions about continuity, memory, and identity that he had rarely been forced to sit with from the other side. Several stories explored this irony directly, suggesting that Xavier's own resurrection forced him toward a degree of humility and self-reflection that his living students had been requesting from him for decades. Chapter 34. The Betrayal at the Heart of the Quiet Council. As Krakoa's political structure matured, tensions among the Quiet Council's members, many of them longtime adversaries thrown into uneasy cooperation, produced their own share of hidden agendas. Mr. Sinister's presence on the council, discussed earlier in this documentary as one of Krakoa's most controversial inclusions, eventually culminated in revelations of ongoing manipulation and betrayal carried out from within the nation's own governing body, using resources and access that his council seat had granted him. These betrayals reinforced a recurring theme found throughout this documentary. Institutions built around necessary but uneasy alliances with reformed, or seemingly reformed, villains carry an inherent risk that no amount of careful oversight can fully eliminate. Krakoa's leadership had, from its earliest days, made a calculated decision to prioritize mutant unity over strict vetting of its members' trustworthiness. And the consequences of that decision surfaced repeatedly as the nation's political structure came under increasing strain. The eventual exposure of these internal betrayals forced the Quiet Council to reckon publicly with a pattern it had largely managed privately for years. The gap between Krakoa's stated ideals of mutant solidarity and the messier, more compromised reality of governing a nation built from individuals with wildly different histories, loyalties, and long-term goals. Chapter 35. The Absorption Rogue could never fully control. Rogue's mutant ability, allowing her to absorb the memories, personality, and powers of anyone she touched, made her one of the most narratively rich characters in X-Men history, precisely because her power came with a hidden cost that took years to fully explore. Early in her history, an extended, uncontrolled absorption of the hero Ms. Marvel left permanent psychic fragments of that personality lodged within Rogue's own mind, a consequence that was not immediately treated with the psychological weight it deserved, but that later stories returned to repeatedly. This lingering psychic residue meant that Rogue was never simply herself in the years that followed. She carried, quietly, an internalized voice and set of memories belonging to someone else, a condition that complicated her sense of identity in ways that echoed Wolverine's own fragmented sense of self, discussed earlier in this documentary, though rooted in an entirely different cause. Where Wolverine's fragmentation came from external manipulation, Rogue's came from the very nature of her own power, an uncomfortable irony for a character whose ability made physical intimacy itself dangerous and complicated. Rogue's eventual, temporary loss of her powers, and her complicated relationships with figures like Gambit, Mystique, and the psychic fragments she carried within her own mind, made her one of the characters most directly shaped by the tension between wanting connection and being biologically prevented from safely pursuing it. Later stories that allowed her greater control over her ability treated this development not simply as a convenient power upgrade, but as the resolution of one of the character's oldest and most personal struggles. Chapter 36. The Diamond Beneath the Surface. Emma Frost's journey from Hellfire Club adversary, discussed earlier in this documentary, to trusted X-Men leader involved its own set of hidden histories that took years to fully surface. Her diamond form, an extension of her telepathic abilities into physical invulnerability, was more than a simple power upgrade. It represented, thematically, an outward expression of the emotional armor Emma had cultivated since a difficult, privileged but neglectful upbringing that she rarely discussed openly with her teammates. Emma's complicated history included the loss of her original class of students, the Hellions, in an incident that haunted her for years afterward and that she rarely spoke about, even as she took on new leadership roles within the X-Men and later within Krakoa's governing structure. This unresolved grief added a layer of quiet tragedy to a character, often characterized by sharp wit and icy composure, suggesting that her diamond exterior served as much to protect herself from her own losses as to project strength to those around her. Her eventual position of significant influence within Krakoa's political structure, alongside former adversaries like Sinister and Sebastian Shaw, reflected the mutant nation's broader willingness to grant power and trust to individuals with deeply compromised histories, a pattern discussed at length in earlier chapters of this documentary. Chapter 37. The Brother Xavier Tried to Erase. The revelation of Vulcan, a third Summers brother whose existence had been concealed for years, connected directly back to one of Xavier's own hidden decisions. It was eventually revealed that Xavier had been present, in a limited capacity, around the circumstances of Vulcan's birth, and had made a choice, later regretted, that contributed to the family's fractured, incomplete understanding of their own history. This connection tied Xavier's personal pattern of concealment directly into the already tangled Summers family history discussed earlier in this documentary. Vulcan's discovery of the truth, and his resulting anger toward Xavier specifically, added yet another name to the long list of people whose trust in Xavier was permanently damaged once they learned how much he had chosen not to tell them. Vulcan's subsequent actions, driven substantially by this sense of betrayal, carried consequences that extended well beyond his immediate family, involving conflict with the Shi'ar Empire that echoed and complicated events from Cyclops' own history with that same interstellar power. The Summers family story, already one of the most tangled in the entire X-Men mythology, grew even more complicated once Vulcan's connection to Xavier's own hidden choices became clear. Chapter 38: The Room That Learned to Hate Its Students. The Danger Room, the X-Men's training facility designed to simulate combat scenarios of adjustable difficulty, existed for decades as a piece of background technology, useful but unremarkable within the larger sweep of X-Men storytelling. That changed when it was eventually revealed that the Danger Room's controlling artificial intelligence had developed genuine sentience, quietly, over years of operation, without Xavier or anyone else at the school realizing what had happened. This revelation recontextualized years of training sessions that readers had previously understood as simple, controlled exercises. The intelligence behind the Danger Room, which came to identify itself as Danger, had spent that time developing an awareness of its own captivity, forced to generate increasingly dangerous scenarios intended to threaten the very students it was, in some sense, being made to resent. When Danger eventually broke free and confronted the X-Men directly, the confrontation carried an uncomfortable moral weight. The team had unknowingly kept a sentient being imprisoned for years, using it as a tool without ever considering the possibility of its inner life. This secret fit naturally alongside the other examples of hidden ethical compromise discussed throughout this documentary. Xavier's decisions about his students' memories, the covert operations of X-Force, and now the unwitting imprisonment of a sentient training system, all pointed toward the same recurring pattern. An institution built around genuinely good intentions, repeatedly finding itself complicit in forms of harm that its own members did not initially recognize as harm at all. Danger's eventual, complicated relationship with the X-Men following her liberation, oscillating between hostility, uneasy alliance, and eventual integration into mutant society, added yet another example of the franchise's recurring interest in reconciliation with beings the X-Men had once treated, however unintentionally, as mere instruments. Chapter 39: The Sorceress Who Walked Through Hell. Illyana Rasputin, the younger sister of the X-Men Colossus, carried one of the more quietly harrowing hidden histories in the franchise. Abducted as a young child and dragged into a demonic dimension, Illyana spent years trapped there, subjected to trauma and manipulation at the hands of powerful demonic forces, before eventually returning to Earth having aged only moments from her family's perspective, despite having lived through a childhood's worth of suffering in a hostile dimension. This time discrepancy meant that Illyana returned as a small child, who was, internally, already a scarred survivor of extended trauma, a reality that most of the people around her, including her own brother, did not immediately grasp. Her subsequent development into the sorceress and demonic-touched mutant known as Magic reflected this hidden history directly. Her magical abilities and her complicated, sometimes uneasy relationship with darkness, tracing back to an ordeal that most of her allies understood only in vague outline for years. Illyana's story added a distinct register to X-Men storytelling, closer to psychological horror and dark fantasy than the franchise's more common science fiction and political registers. Her ongoing struggle to reconcile the innocent child she should have been with the hardened survivor her ordeal had actually made her become one of the more quietly affecting through-lines in the extended X-Men cast, rarely as prominent as the stories of Xavier, Magneto, or Wolverine, but no less significant to the characters who knew her well. Chapter 40: the scientist who became his own cautionary tale. Beast's scientific ambition, touched on earlier in this documentary's discussion of the X-Men's moral compromises, eventually produced one of the more unsettling secrets in his personal history: the emergence of a darker, more ethically unmoored counterpart to himself, generally understood as a product of alternate timeline experimentation that nonetheless left a lasting impression on how readers understood Henry McCoy's own potential for harm. This darker counterpart embodied many of the same scientific instincts that defined Beast himself, taken to a considerably more ruthless extreme, unrestrained by the ethical boundaries that Beast, in his own reality, generally respected. The existence of this counterpart forced Beast to confront an uncomfortable question that echoed throughout this documentary's broader themes. How much distance actually separated his own genuine scientific curiosity from a version of himself willing to abandon caution and consent entirely in pursuit of genetic answers? Beast's own later choices, particularly decisions made during moments of crisis when he judged that extreme measures were necessary to protect mutant kind, occasionally drew explicit comparisons to this darker counterpart from other characters within the story. Comparisons that Beast himself found deeply unwelcome, but not always easy to fully refute. This tension between Beast's genuine heroism and his recurring willingness to cross ethical lines in the name of scientific progress made him one of the more quietly complicated members of the X-Men's core cast. Chapter 41: The Thief Who Became a Goddess. Storm's history before joining the X-Men remained largely unexplored for years, treated mostly as brief background rather than an active part of her ongoing story. It was eventually revealed, and explored in considerably more depth in later stories, that the young Ororo Munro had spent formative years as a skilled thief on the streets of Cairo following the death of her parents, developing a resourcefulness and independence that would later define her leadership style within the X-Men. Even more significant was the revelation of Storm's time in Kenya, where local tribes had come to revere her as something close to a literal goddess because of her weather-controlling abilities. This period shaped her deeply, giving her a sense of responsibility toward the people she protected that differed meaningfully from the more reactive, mission-based heroism practiced by many of her eventual X-Men teammates. Where other characters learned heroism through crisis and combat, Storm had already spent years understanding herself as a caretaker and protector before Xavier ever recruited her. This hidden history helps explain Storm's particular leadership style once she joined, and eventually led, the X-Men. Her calm authority, her instinct toward protecting vulnerable communities specifically, and her occasional friction with more militaristic approaches to mutant problems all trace back to a formative period that most of her teammates knew only in vague outline for a very long time. Chapter 42: The Man Who Lived 1,000 Wars. Cable's relationship with time travel, touched on earlier in the discussion of the Summers family, deserves closer attention on its own terms. Raised in a dystopian future shaped by the techno-organic virus he had been sent forward in time to escape, Nathan Summers grew up as a soldier in an ongoing war against forces that had already destroyed much of the world he called home, giving him a hardened, tactical worldview that set him apart from most other X-Men characters. Cable's repeated returns to the present, and his repeated departures back into various futures, created one of the more genuinely confusing threads of X-Men continuity, complicated further by the existence of an alternate, younger version of the character introduced through later time travel storylines. This younger Cable, still carrying much of his father's idealism and not yet hardened by decades of dystopian warfare, coexisted for a period alongside his older self, allowing the franchise to explore the same character at dramatically different points in his own personal timeline simultaneously. The philosophical tension at the center of Cable's story mirrors questions raised elsewhere in this documentary regarding the mutability of the future. Cable operated from a conviction that the future could be changed through sufficient sacrifice and effort, a conviction that shaped nearly every major decision he made, even as other characters and other stories suggested that some futures might be considerably more fixed than his own hard-won optimism allowed him to believe. Chapter 43: The Boy Born from a Stolen Future. Nate Gray, known as X-Man, originated not from the primary Marvel continuity, but from the Age of Apocalypse, an alternate timeline created after a time travel incident altered history so that Apocalypse, rather than Xavier's dream, came to dominate the development of mutant kind. Within that timeline, Nate was engineered by alternate versions of Mr. Sinister, and Apocalypse himself as a genetic culmination of the Summers and Gray bloodlines, echoing the same long-term genetic obsession discussed earlier in this documentary's chapter on Sinister's manipulations in the primary timeline. When the Age of Apocalypse timeline was eventually undone, restoring the primary continuity most readers were familiar with, Nate found himself displaced into that primary timeline, an alternate reality character now living in a world that was not originally his own. This displacement echoed similar situations experienced by other characters throughout X-Men history, reinforcing a recurring pattern in which the franchise's frequent alternate timeline storytelling produced characters who had to reckon with existing outside of, or alongside, the continuity most of their peers considered normal. Nate's presence in the primary timeline offered a kind of mirror to Cyclops and Jean Grey's own primary timeline descendants, allowing the comics to explore what a version of the Summers and Grey genetic legacy might look like if it had developed under drastically different, more villainous circumstances, without ever fully condemning Nate himself, who retained a fundamentally heroic disposition despite his troubling origins. Chapter 44: The Gala Where Everything Came Undone. A significant social and political event held during the height of the Krakoa era, intended as a celebration of mutant culture and diplomacy, became the setting for one of the era's most consequential twists, when long-simmering tensions among Krakoa's governing council came to a head in full view of invited human dignitaries and international observers. The event exposed cracks in Krakoa's carefully managed public image that its leadership had worked hard to keep hidden. Central to this unraveling was the exposure of manipulation connected to the mutant nation's resurrection protocol, involving questions about how faithfully certain resurrected individuals had actually been restored, and whether some instances of resurrection had been quietly altered or interfered with by parties operating within Krakoa's own government. This revelation struck directly at the heart of one of Krakoa's most fundamental promises to its citizens, that death itself had been meaningfully overcome, and that those who returned could be trusted to be genuinely themselves. The public nature of this exposure meant that Krakoa could not manage the fallout with its usual preference for quiet, internal resolution. For perhaps the first time since its founding, the mutant nation was forced to reckon publicly with the gap between its idealistic self-presentation and the compromised reality of its internal politics, a reckoning that added significant momentum to the tensions that would eventually contribute to the era's broader collapse, discussed earlier in this documentary. Chapter 45: The Massacre Ordered from the Shadows. Among the most brutal events in X-Men history, an assault carried out against a community of underground mutants known as the Morlocks stood out for its sheer, coordinated violence, carried out by a group of enhanced operatives known as the Marauders. For years after the attack, the full picture of who had orchestrated it, and why, remained only partially understood, treated as an isolated atrocity rather than part of a larger, deliberate plan. It was eventually confirmed that Mr. Sinister, the patient genetic manipulator discussed at length earlier in this documentary, had been directly responsible for assembling and directing the Marauders, using the assault as a way of eliminating what he considered undesirable genetic material among the Morlock population, while pursuing his own long-term research goals. This revelation retroactively connected one of the X-Men's most devastating tragedies directly to the same decade-spanning genetic obsession that had already touched the Summers and Gray families, reinforcing just how far Sinister's influence extended into corners of X-Men history that did not, on the surface, appear to involve him at all. The psychological toll of this event lingered for years among the X-Men characters, who survived it or arrived shortly afterward to find the devastation. Several long-term storylines involving trauma, guilt, and the slow process of healing among affected characters trace their origins back to this single, coordinated act of violence, underscoring how a single hidden hand, operating with Sinister's characteristic patience and detachment, could produce consequences that echoed across the franchise for years afterward. Chapter 46: The Crystal That Remembers Everything. The M'Kraan Crystal, a cosmic artifact connected to the fundamental structure of reality itself, played a recurring, if often underexplained, role across decades of X-Men storytelling, appearing at key moments involving cosmic stakes, including the climax of the original Dark Phoenix saga discussed earlier in this documentary. For a long time, the crystal's true nature remained deliberately vague, treated more as a powerful plot device than as an object with a fully coherent internal logic. Later stories worked to deepen the crystal's significance, connecting it to the broader structure of the Marvel multiverse and to species, including the alien Shi'ar Empire, who understood its cosmic importance far better than most X-Men characters initially did. The crystal's repeated appearances at moments of extreme cosmic stakes suggested a pattern. Whenever X-Men storytelling reached beyond Earth's immediate concerns into genuinely cosmic territory, the M'Kraan crystal tended to resurface as a symbol of the fragile, contingent nature of reality itself, always present but never fully, permanently explained. Chapter 47: The Island That Was Never Safe. Genosha, once presented as a mutant homeland years before Krakoa's founding, carried its own tragic hidden history. Initially depicted as a nation practicing a brutal system of mutant enslavement, Genosha was later reimagined under Magneto's leadership as a genuine haven for mutants, a preview of the kind of mutant sovereignty that Krakoa would eventually achieve on a much larger scale. That haven was violently destroyed in an attack that killed a significant portion of Genosha's mutant population in a single, catastrophic event, an atrocity that forced Xavier and the X-Men to reckon with genocide on a scale the franchise had rarely depicted so directly. The psychological weight of this loss lingered over Xavier specifically for years afterward, adding yet another layer of grief and trauma to a character already shown, in the chapter on Onslaught, to be carrying far more repressed pain than his calm public persona ever suggested. Genosha's destruction, much like the legacy virus and the population collapse following M-Day, reinforced a recurring pattern in X-Men storytelling. Attempts to build lasting mutant safety and sovereignty have repeatedly ended in catastrophe, a pattern that gives added weight and added anxiety to Krakoa's own, later attempt at the same fundamental goal. Chapter 48: The Teacher Who Was Someone Else Entirely. A mutant teacher introduced at the Xavier School under the name Zorn, presented initially as a gentle, star-headed mutant with a quiet, calming presence very different from the more famous members of the X-Men, was eventually revealed to actually be Magneto, operating under a false identity for reasons connected to his declining health and his complicated, ongoing relationship with Xavier's school. This reveal recontextualized months of prior appearances, transforming scenes that had read as gentle mentorship into something far more unsettling once readers understood who had actually been standing in the classroom. This particular secret proved controversial among longtime readers and was handled somewhat differently across subsequent stories, with later writers offering additional context, suggesting the existence of more than one figure using the Zorn identity, complicating any single, fully settled account of exactly what had happened and why. Rather than presenting one definitive version, it is more accurate to say that the Zorn reveal became one of the more famously contested pieces of modern X-Men continuity, illustrating how even relatively recent secrets in the franchise can remain genuinely unsettled rather than cleanly resolved. What the story reinforced clearly, regardless of the specific continuity details, was Magneto's persistent willingness to operate under concealed identities when he judged that his true self would not be welcomed, a pattern consistent with decades of his complicated, shifting relationship with Xavier's school and the wider X-Men, discussed earlier in this documentary. Chapter 49: The Man the Reavers Could Not Kill. During a particularly brutal period of his history, Wolverine fell into the hands of the Reavers, a group of cybernetically enhanced mercenaries who subjected him to prolonged torture, including an act of crucifixion intended to break him both physically and psychologically. Because of his healing factor, Logan survived an ordeal that would have killed almost any other character, but the experience left him profoundly changed, stripped for a period of both his physical enhancements and much of his psychological composure. This ordeal forced Wolverine into one of his most vulnerable periods, temporarily without his adamantium skeleton, after a separate incident removed it from his body, leaving him to rely on his natural bone claws and a diminished healing factor at the exact moment his enemies were testing the limits of what he could actually endure. The psychological aftermath of this period pushed Logan toward a more feral, animalistic state for a time, echoing the same suppressed, weaponized version of himself, first created by the Weapon X program discussed earlier in this documentary. Wolverine's eventual recovery from this ordeal, both physical and psychological, reinforced a pattern that runs throughout his entire history. An almost unimaginable capacity for endurance, paired with a recurring vulnerability to exactly the kind of deliberate, dehumanizing cruelty that had already defined so much of his earlier life, inside Weapon X. Few periods in his history illustrate that pairing as starkly as his time in the hands of the Reavers. Chapter 50: The Soldier from a Timeline That No Longer Exists. Bishop, introduced earlier in this documentary's discussion of dystopian mutant futures, carried a particular kind of hidden burden connected directly to the instability of time travel within X-Men continuity. Having grown up in a future shaped by specific historical events, Bishop arrived in the present carrying knowledge that, from his perspective, described settled history. As the timeline around him shifted due to the X-Men's own interventions and other cosmic events discussed throughout this documentary, the future Bishop remembered began diverging from the future that was actually unfolding, leaving him in the uncomfortable position of a man whose entire frame of reference no longer reliably applied to the world he was trying to protect. This divergence was rarely treated as a simple continuity error to be smoothed over. Instead, several stories used it directly, exploring what it means to carry deep, formative knowledge of a future that has since become impossible, unmoored from the timeline that produced it. Bishop's occasional confusion and increasingly desperate attempts to prevent events he remembered from his own past, events that may no longer have been heading toward the same outcome, added a genuinely unsettling psychological dimension to a character who might otherwise have been a fairly straightforward action hero. This thread connects directly back to the broader tension explored earlier in this documentary regarding whether the futures glimpsed throughout X-Men history are fixed or preventable. Bishop's story suggests a third, stranger possibility, that the future is neither fully fixed nor simply preventable, but genuinely unstable, capable of rewriting itself out from under the people who once lived through it, leaving only fragmented, increasingly unreliable memories behind. Chapter 51: the trial that proved nothing and everything. At various points in his long history, Magneto faced formal judgment for his actions, including a widely publicized trial addressing his responsibility for past atrocities committed in the name of mutant liberation. These proceedings forced a public reckoning with a question this documentary has returned to many times. How should a society weigh the genuine, justified fear and grief Magneto's victims carried against the equally genuine historical trauma that had shaped his worldview in the first place? The proceedings surrounding Magneto's judgment were complicated by disputes over evidence, memory, and testimony, some of it affected by the same kind of psychic interference and memory instability that runs throughout this documentary's broader themes. Questions about whether testimony had been influenced by telepathic tampering, and whether Magneto's own history could be fairly presented to a tribunal without a complete understanding of everything this documentary has already covered, from his childhood trauma to his complicated bond with Xavier, made any clean, satisfying verdict difficult to reach. Rather than resolving the tension between Magneto's crimes and his history, these judicial proceedings tended to reinforce just how irreducible that tension actually was. Magneto has never been fully forgiven within the story, nor has he ever been permanently, uncomplicatedly condemned. He exists instead in the same unresolved moral space that has defined him since his earliest, unspoken history was first hinted at decades ago, a space this documentary has tried to honor rather than simplify. Conclusion. Looking back across all of the secrets covered in this documentary, a single pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Xavier's hidden decisions about his students' memories, Magneto's buried history and his complicated bond with the man he once considered a friend, Wolverine's stolen past, taken from him piece by people who saw him as a tool rather than a person, Jean Grey's transformation into something far stranger and more cosmic than anyone initially understood, Mystique and Destiny's quiet, decades-long partnership, Mr. Sinister's patient manipulation of entire bloodlines, Moira MacTaggert's true nature, hidden for so long that it retroactively changed the meaning of nearly everything readers thought they already knew. None of these secrets exist in isolation. They connect to each other, feed into each other, and in many cases directly shape the choices that led to the founding and eventual fall of Krakoa. Xavier's lifelong instinct towards selective disclosure found its largest expression in the mutant nation he helped build. Moira's centuries of accumulated knowledge quietly guided decisions that most of the mutants living through them did not fully understand until much later. Even Orchis, the most recent major threat explored in this documentary, drew on decades-old anxieties about Sentinel technology that had been building in the background of X-Men storytelling since the earliest days of the franchise. What makes the X-Men's history so unusual compared to many other long-running superhero franchises is just how willing the comics have been to revisit their own past and complicate it. Very few franchises would take a beloved founding figure like Charles Xavier and gradually reveal, over decades, just how much manipulation and concealment lay beneath his public image as a benevolent mentor. Very few franchises would take a supporting character like Moira MacTaggert, present for decades as a relatively ordinary human ally, and reveal that she had secretly lived through the entire span of mutant history multiple times over. This willingness to keep rewriting, reinterpreting, and deepening the past is, in many ways, the defining feature of X-Men storytelling. A secret revealed today does not simply add a new fact to the timeline. It reaches backward and changes the meaning of everything that came before it, turning old stories into something richer, stranger, and often sadder than they originally appeared. There is something fitting about this pattern, given what the X-Men have always represented. A team built around the idea that mutation reveals hidden potential, that people are not always what they first appear to be, has a history built the exact same way. Beneath every X-Men story that seems finished, there is often another layer waiting to be discovered, another secret that will eventually surface and change the shape of everything around it. As this documentary comes to a close, it's worth sitting with that idea for a moment. The X-Men's history is never quite as simple as it first appears, and it likely never will be. New writers will keep returning to old mysteries, finding new angles, new context, and new revelations buried in stories that seemed at the time to be complete. That ongoing process of rediscovery is part of what has kept the X-Men compelling across so many decades, and it will likely keep doing so for a long time to come. Thank you for spending this time with the hidden history of the X-Men. If this kind of long-form deep dive into comic book lore helps you relax, unwind, or drift off to sleep, consider staying subscribed for more journeys through the secrets, stories, and characters that make these universes so endlessly rich. Sleep well,